Well, today on the show, I'm joined by Justin Schieber. Justin and I sit down to speak about the Hiddenness Argument by J.L. Schellenberg. This conversation, I hope, serves as a way for you to begin to understand and explore what hiddenness means and looks like within the philosophical landscape. What we do is we go through a host of questions and thoughts and areas of interest around the hiddenness argument. And at the very end of the conversation, we begin to touch on and reflect on and look at Schellenberg's syllogistic form of the argument. It's a great conversation. I love Justin. I love the work he does on the Real Atheology podcast. So make sure you check out the links to both Schellenberg's work and Justin Schieber's podcast and resources. If it's your first time checking out the show, I'd ask you to hit the subscribe button and then select the bell notification icon. That way you'll be reminded whenever we release a video here on the channel. And if you wouldn't mind giving this video a thumbs up and then sharing it with your friends, your family, and your followers, we grow because you take the time to share our content. So thank you. And please do share this far and wide. Okay, enough of that. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Justin Schieber on J.L. Schellenberg's The Hiddenness Argument. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel and today I'm joined by Justin Schieber. Justin, it's good to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Sam.
So today we're going to be talking about J.L. Schellenberg's The Hiddenness Argument. I'm aware that there are other versions of a sort of hiddenness argument. This is the sort of one we're going to be kind of looking at today. For those listening, I'm pulling up the book. I'm very excited because I managed to kind of slam through this book in a week, and then I rewatched all the videos that you yourself did, Justin, on the Real Atheology podcast to get myself ready for this. There's some fantastic content out there. So listen, of you, there'll be links to the book in the description as well as Justin's videos. So if you want to kind of get fresh up to speed straight away, you can do that. But otherwise, we're going to be diving into it today. Before I get you to introduce yourself, Justin, it'd probably be worth saying for those listening or watching, we're going to be going through kind of a lot of content that's kind of going to be supporting or pushing back against some of the premises. And then at the very end of the conversation, we're going to be pulling up the sort of syllogistic form of the argument, essentially. So don't worry too much if you're not familiar with the argument, because all the sort of preamble is kind of, I would call that the good stuff. It's going to help us to really explore the argument at the very end of the conversation. So I'm going to stop waffling, Justin. Would you mind kind of giving my audience a bit of an overview about you and the work you do within philosophy?
Oh, yeah. So my name's Justin, and I'm primarily interested in philosophy of religion. And so about 10 years or so ago, I started a YouTube channel / podcast called Real Atheology, where me and a couple of other more secular-minded friends of mine explore issues in philosophy of religion from that perspective. And so we're looking at arguments, for or against the existence of God, analyzing them. We have our biases, and so it's not going to be completely, perfectly even-handed in that way. But we've got our opinions, we've got our views, but we try to be as fair and as charitable as we can with regard to those with whom we disagree. We just find these topics super interesting. I think that's, I don't understand people who don't find these topics very interesting, right? So I'm always, like my idea of small talk frightens other people. so it's those are the topics that kind of like really kind of turn me on intellectually, and so that's what I've been doing for a while. I did take a break for a number of years, but I'm back doing the show, and so hiddenness was always an argument that I really liked and I thought was super interesting, and so recently I embarked on this series exploring arguments for hiddenness generally, and Schellenberg's argument in particular. And so that's what we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, I'm really, really looking forward to it. It might be helpful to give the audience a bit of an overview of your story, if you don't mind. Just be helpful to kind of hear kind of not necessarily how you were raised, but kind of what you potentially once believed, whether you were ever kind of a Christian or theist or anything, and kind of what kind of brought you to kind of where you are today in like a short synopsis, if that's possible.
Yeah, so I am a former believer. So I was raised like most American kids to be a Christian of some sort or another, right? I was kind of this vague, non-denominational Protestant type Christian church, and it was something I really, really got into. I joined the joined the worship team, and led a number of worship services for the I should say for like the youth group and stuff. So, but it was something I was very interested in. Like my entire social structure was the church, so I very much got a lot out of it. Unfortunately, as is common, I think, for a lot of people, that like my prayer life I started to have this unshakable sense that I was kind of just talking to myself, not really interacting with another person, right? I was interacting with myself and my thoughts of what I think such a deity would be like. And at first, everyone's going to have these doubts. You just kind of persist through it, you push through it. But there is a point in time where you have to start being honest with yourself about what you feel that you're perceiving. And I did not feel that I was perceiving a connection with any divine person. And so that was like a terrifying thing to realize. But when I did, that was kind of the point of no return for me. So yeah, I'm a former believer. I consider myself an atheist at this point. So yeah, that's me. So an atheist very interested in religion.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting. So I'm probably going to annoy a lot of people now, but I'm actually a big fan of C.S. Lewis. Obviously was atheist, became Christian.
Yeah.
I like him because I think he understands what atheism is. Whereas a lot of kind of Christians writing have never lived in that sort of kind of framework at all. Whereas obviously yourself being a believer and then kind of coming into this sort of atheist camp, you understand what belief looked like, lived like, felt like if you've been there and done it. So I think you bring a really interesting sort of dynamic to this space, which is great. Okay, so we're going to be diving into hiddenness, as we've mentioned a few times now. Kind of when I've spoken about hiddenness to people before, because it's also kind of tracks with my journey too, I kind of point at things like kind of, I guess, God being hidden within the Bible. Like we look at things like Job, for instance, and obviously kind of God doesn't actually rock up until the last kind of chapter or two of the book of Job. It's like 40 chapters long. It's pretty intense. We look at things like Jesus's parables where he's kind of talking, but in a very kind of veiled way, potentially. Again, this sort of kind of hidden message within this framework. So I guess to start off with, doesn't it seem a bit odd to have an argument for atheism that's actually based on hiddenness itself?
Yeah, it does. So, and a lot of that, I think a lot of the confusion there, not confusion. I mean, it's a reasonable, I think, inference there. To think of it in that way, words can mean different things in different contexts, right? So, hiddenness, you're right. Like if you can mean this in like two senses, right? You can mean like there can be like a non-literal sense of hiddenness and then a literal sense of hiddenness, right? Where the literal sense is where like God exists and he's literally hiding from other people. And so like this is the kind of thing that you'd find in the biblical stories, right? So people calling out for God, like this is a common theme within like the Pentateuch and stuff. And so like you've got these people calling out God, where they believe, but they believe God is like hiding. He's keeping a distance from them, perhaps to punish them, perhaps for another reason, whatever the case may be. But that's a sense in which God is hidden. And so, like, it seems really confusing to be like, okay, well, God hides, therefore atheism. You know what I mean? Like, that's a really a strange kind of inference. And so, what's important is that we think about hiddenness, at least in the context of Schellenberg's argument, as being a non-literal kind of hiddenness. With this kind of hiddenness, we're focused on the fact that it's there are certain kinds of non-belief that exist. And so the hiddenness is that, like, it's epistemically hidden from people. That if God exists, it's epistemically hidden for a number of people, right? And so there are particular kinds of non-belief that allegedly pose serious problems for theism. And so that's generally what the hiddenness argument is getting at. It's, obviously not presupposing that God exists. It's saying, what would be the case if God in fact did exist? Well, we would think, for a number of different reasons, that certain types of non-belief would not exist. And so that's kind of where the argument is pointing toward.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I think as well, kind of a lot of people often view hiddenness as being kind of synonymous or existing alongside something like the problem of evil. So they'll look at something like the problem of evil and they'll go, evidentially speaking, there is X amount of suffering in the world, and there's no sign of God kind of stopping it. He's hidden within it. And they'll lump these two arguments together and kind of present them as a sort of single case. Schellenberg does a really nice job of kind of dragging those two things apart. And, he says, they can be brought together in tandem, but actually they are separate, distinct arguments. Would you mind just exploring that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So the idea being that, like, the two, the main, most popular objection to the existence of God is the argument from evil, right? So it's an appeal to facts about the world. So you say, okay, look, there are bad things that happen, evil things that happen. So this particular kind of evil, or maybe just the fact of evil at all, the fact that it exists, shows that God does not exist or is evidence against God. So that's the problem of evil, like, broadly speaking. So the question is, okay, is hiddenness just a kind of problem of evil, just like a species of the broader genus? And I think not. So Schellenberg says no, and I agree with him. I find his reasoning here to be correct. So what he's pointing out is that, like, the evidence on the table in the hiddenness argument is not bad stuff. The evidence rather is the lack of certain, like, epistemic states, doxastic states, essentially. So that the fact that people don't have particular beliefs. And so it's not that these states are bad states, right? These are neutral states. Some of them might be good states. Some of these people might be living very, very good lives, but just God is hidden to them. So it might be that they would live better lives if they believed God exists. That could be possible. But it remains the case that the evidence that is being appealed to in the hiddenness argument is not of the same kind as the evidence that's appealed to in problem of evil. And so I do think that these are distinct arguments. You have bad stuff on the one hand, right, broadly speaking, and then you have some interesting facts about the belief states that are being that are had by persons. These are two distinct things, and I think that they can motivate toward the same conclusion.
Yeah, I really like how you said that. I think it is absolutely fascinating that, as you mentioned, there's a sort of bad state of things, but also the sort of hiddenness argument. We're going to get onto the sort of term non-resistant non-believers in due course, but you're right. The sort of kind of way people believe or don't believe doesn't have to be positive or negative. It could just be, it could be positive, could be negative, could be neutral as well, which brings a really interesting curveball to the whole conversation. Schellenberg kind of talks about this sort of idea of ultimism, which I found to be really interesting. And then he kind of tries to kind of draw that out into kind of what theism might look like on this idea of ultimism. So I'm going to quote here from Schellenberg. So, quote, "The general claim that there is a reality ultimate in three ways: in the nature of things, metaphysically, in inherent value, axiologically, and in its importance for our lives, soteriologically." So that's how he's kind of defining ultimism as these three things: metaphysically, axiologically, and soteriologically. So I guess with that in mind, do you think it's fair for us to begin to look at theism as almost equating to this sort of personal ultimism?
I do. So I think what Schellenberg offers with ultimism, so this is just a concept that he's like forwarding, right, as to mean a divine or religious reality, right? So Schellenberg wants to say, like, okay, he wants to have these concepts that kind of latch onto that. So, like, for example, you could have like a supernatural reality, but the supernatural reality might not be soteriologically relevant. It might not be of any religious significance. And so, like, there's a need, arguably, for a concept that addresses what we are interested in when we're talking about the religious life, right? So, so again, hitting those three components, like it's got to be metaphysically ultimate, like it's the grounding of all things, essentially. It's got to be the explanation of value, or be tied to at least the greatest instantiation of value. And then also it has to have like great significance for our lives. And so certainly theists should think that theism hits all of those. And so the question is, okay, well, if theism does that, then it belongs under this category of ultimism. But ultimism doesn't necessarily need to be theism, right? It could be non-personal. So Schellenberg's just making the modest claim that, like, look, if we spell out ultimism in a personal way, where it's a single person at the heart of all things important religiously, then that's just what people mean by theism, arguably. And so, yeah, I think that that's entirely appropriate. And I don't, and obviously there is some discussion in this in the literature. I'm not super familiar with those particular discussions, but to me, it seems on its face to be an appropriate categorization of theism.
Yeah, what I really like about it is it kind of, I guess it really, really well in sort of encapsulates a lot of our ideas of what Christianity could be. So you've got kind of Protestantism, kind of evangelical Christianity, or even Pentecostal Christianity. Like all of those fit into this idea because that's almost like a sort of duality nature where there's this person that we can kind of understand and seek and know, but it also kind of encapsulates a more sort of like Catholic or Catholicism's instantiation of God. I was looking at someone like Thomas Aquinas, like God being the insubstantiation of everything, like being itself, that is God. And it's really interesting that this thing that we're kind of defining as personal ultimism can hit the sort of kind of classic, I know God personally, but also that God is being itself, and we have our existence from this place of being itself. It's kind of beautifully put, actually, I think, in the book. It's pretty cool.
Agreed.
Okay, sweet. So I guess the next thing I want to chat through then is the idea that the hiddenness argument almost, not like a vulture circling like something that's dying on the ground, but it kind of circles this sort of idea of like, I guess, inconclusive evidence for God. Like we're looking for this thing out there, but we're struggling to find it. And that's a sort of area that this argument kind of goes around. I guess the question really is kind of, if we did come to the decision or realization from this argument or somewhere else that there is inconclusive evidence for God, should that be taken as conclusive reason to disbelieve in a God?
So Schellenberg's going to say yes. He's going to say that, like, at least if by inconclusive we mean that there are persons out there who, like, reasonably just don't have theistic belief. And so they've, they their beliefs are presumably, somewhat rational, and they've taken note of the evidence available to them, and yet they don't have theistic beliefs. So the question is, okay, like, it's inconclusive for them, right? The evidence available to them does not like bring them to theistic belief. It's not compelling for them. It's not conclusive for them. And so Schellenberg's going to say that, yeah, particular kinds of non-belief are very strong reason to think that God does not exist. And so that's essentially the core of the Hiddenness argument, is this claim that there are these alleged forms of non-belief, and again, spelled out in the inconclusive evidence sense, that God does not exist. So that's essentially the argument.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess in sort of philosophical terms, the argument itself is like a pretty recent thing. Like if you think about, we're still talking about Descartes and stuff, right? We're still going back many hundreds of years, and then we kind of also go back to sort of Plato and thousands of years. Like philosophy's got a really, and probably before that, a really long history and sort of lineage to it. But the actual hiddenness argument itself is recent within sort of philosophical terms. I guess
Yes.
the question that kind of I want to ask about this then is really, what is it about society now that makes it possible for this argument, or arguments within the hiddenness vein, to actually begin to bring a challenge to theistic beliefs?
Yeah, so I don't think there's anything particularly special now that would make it possible in the strict sense, right? So in my view, I think it was, perfectly possible that someone could have come across this argument in a more rigorous way. So yeah, like you're saying, with regard to the philosophical literature, this is a relatively recent argument, about 3 decades now, to where it's been like really robustly presented and defended in a sophisticated way, right? Prior to that, you have people gesturing toward this idea, but no one really formulating it in a rigorous way. And so that's what Schellenberg does in 1993 for the first time. I don't think, though, that there's anything about like society as it is now that like uniquely allowed for that. I just think that like it's just a matter of interesting historical contingency. That said, there are some features of the world that make the evidence more obvious, or more perhaps, I guess, present to mind. So while it was always possible to come up with this argument, I think that like certain facts about the world make it more prevalent. And so, like, if you think about like the interconnectedness of the world now, right? Where it's, if you have access to internet, if you have access to the media generally, you're going to be much more aware of people who do not believe like you do, right? And so if you're a theist, growing up in a small isolated tribe or something, and that's all you know, then it does become quite surprising when you come across other people who genuinely hold entirely different, incompatible beliefs than with what you have. And so just the variety of belief systems out there, and the fact that the modern world kind of presents us with this fact in a way that it has not before, kind of puts a special shine to hiddenness concerns, I think. So yeah, there is a sense in which the modern world does kind of underline the hiddenness concern.
Yeah, I kind of feel like there's so much connectivity nowadays as well. It's almost like everybody can find out about different religious viewpoints and vantage points, and begin to see those sort of conflicting narratives, and how it doesn't make sense for even like the 3 major sort of Abrahamic religions to coexist. They all say kind of fundamentally different things about the same God. So you kind of have this conundrum you need to try and fit together. Which kind of feeds quite nicely into the next question, really, which is this idea that kind of non-resistant non-belief doesn't always seem to initially strike people as obviously relevant to whether God exists. I kind of want to ask you about this, but I guess I'll kind of frame it a little bit as well. So if I kind of look at or speak to some of my theist friends about non-resistant non-belief, for them, they kind of say, well, look at Tasmania 400 years ago, before, people landed there that kind of then, wiped out the original inhabitants. Those people were obviously kind of non-resistantly not believing in Jesus or God or whatever sort of theistic tradition you want to hold. So it doesn't for them feel like it's initially kind of relevant to whether God exists, that there are non-resistant non-believers. So why do you think it should strike us, or do you think it's actually something we need to grapple with philosophically to help it to strike us?
I do think that there is an intuitive sense in which it does pose a problem for theism. I think that you don't really need to do a lot of philosophical work to kind of see this. And I think this is reflected in some of the ways that some more prominent theistic traditions view non-belief. Many among them view non-belief in a very negative light, right? That there's something morally untoward about not believing in God. That if you don't believe in God, there's something defective, morally or otherwise, about you. And that kind of, I think that's a bit of a tell. It's a bit of a defensive posture, because I think that at least with regard to people who take the notion of God seriously, there is some clear tension that's kind of highlighted when you learn about people who don't believe in God, right? Well, God is all loving. What do you mean? Why is he, if he exists, why is he hiding from people? That's a pretty obvious question, right? That's going to pop up when you learn about other people who do not believe. And so the non-resistant non-believer part is just like saying, okay, well, setting aside the issue that some people may not believe in God because they, want to rebel, or they want to do stuff and not be, have their behavior monitored, or whatever the case may be. Clearly not everyone's like that, right? Or at least that's the claim, Schellenberg's claim. Some people, quite reasonably, and morally thoughtful people, do not believe in God. And that in particular, that form of non-belief in particular, is, I think, very intuitively in some great deal of tension with theistic belief. So, I think there's a sense in which it's obvious and a sense in which it's not obvious. But I don't necessarily think you need to go, I don't think you need the full philosophical argument to at least see the prima facie tension involved there.
Yeah, that's really well said. And it fits really nicely into kind of where I wanted to take the conversation as well. I know that within the book, The Hiddenness Argument, Schellenberg talks about the sort of idea of using different terms to resistant and non-resistant. He talks about sort of culpability and inculpability. So it'd be interesting, Justin, to understand kind of why you think Schellenberg decided to use resistant and non-resistant over culpability and inculpability for this argument.
Yeah, so I guess there's a little bit of a history here, right? So in his 1993 book, Divine Hiddenness and Human Reason, he does use inculpable non-belief. That's the phrase he uses. And of course, in the early to mid 2000s, he shifts to the language that you're using today, the non-resistant non-belief, right? And the reason he does this, at least how I interpret him, he means to focus. So he's always intended to focus on specifically resistant forms of non-belief, but he used this broader sense of culpability. But then he started getting pressed in the literature on how there are many ways in which one could be culpable for your non-belief. Not all of them are going to be resistance, and he thinks that resistance is really where the meat is at. That God should ensure belief for all persons, unless they're just full-on, like full-bore self-deceptive resistance, and you know, and God's not going to like force those persons to believe in him. Those persons, he has to, you know, he's going to respect their freedom in that sense. So, so the shift was primarily a narrowing in scope from his language, not necessarily in what he was intending for the argument, but yeah, again, he moved from culpability, which is a broader term, to a very specific form of culpability, namely a self-deceptive resistance culpability. So that's kind of how he wants to, that's how he developed the argument over time. And since early to mid 2000s or so, he's stuck with the non-resistant language, and I think he's seen some good gains as a result.
Yeah, it's been really interesting seeing the argument develop over the years, especially in that vein. I kind of want to bring in the idea of innocence. I kind of want to frame it as well. So I spoke to Graham Oppy recently on the show. I think it's just gone live as we're speaking. But for those who haven't seen it, basically Oppy kind of defines innocence as people who've never considered the God question, and therefore they are non-believers. So I kind of want to bring that to the fore to speak about the idea of kind of reflective non-believers versus unreflective non-believers. And I guess the question really is around whether or not it matters if non-belief is negative or neutral for the hiddenness argument to stand. So the sort of example that I have is, you could say that there is a non-believer who's an ex-believer, who is racked with doubt about kind of God. When they look for God, they just couldn't find him and therefore don't believe, versus someone like an innocent, as Oppy would define it, who've never even looked or thought about the God question. Like, does it have to be one of those two, or can both of those two fit within this argument for it to stand?
So both of those two categories can certainly count as non-resistant non-belief, right? So as you mentioned, the what was the word you used? Reflective versus non-reflective non-belief, right? So Schellenberg is interested in non-belief, just simpliciter, right? And that's going to include reflective, it's going to include non-reflective. So on the reflective side, you're going to have people who've thought about it and have come to a conclusion based on the evidence available to them, but that conclusion is not belief in God, right? So you can have your reflective atheists, right? Someone who has, you know, whether or not they used to believe, right? Whatever the case may be about their history, currently they believe that God does not exist. They actually hold that belief. And they do that for, you know, maybe the problem of evil or something to that effect, right? And then you can have agnostics. So agnostics are people who have considered the question, but they think that the evidence is just, you know, evidence and like other like pre-theoretic concerns are it's like an even wash, to where it's like they don't feel safe kind of going in either direction, right? They're going to say, well, I just don't know. I just don't have enough evidence. I don't have what I need to make a conclusion on this. So they're going to essentially suspend judgment. Or they just think that it's like exactly 50-50. And so they're not going to hold one way or the other. So those are like reflective non-believers. Now, on the other side, you can have unreflective non-belief, right? And this can include innocence, such as you mentioned, Graham Oppy's term there, where people like say isolated tribes in the Amazon or something, or like very early humans. So like prior to like the development of monotheism, right? So early humans, isolated tribes. These are people who like may have religious concepts, but they just don't have the religious concept of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and you know, all-good God. They just don't have that. They have, you know, other supernatural concepts, and so they lack belief in God. But it's not because they've ever even confronted it or even you know, considered the idea. So they've not really come to a conclusion based on an assessment of the concept, like holding it up to the evidence to see how it you know, how it fares. So that's a form of unreflective nonbelief. Unreflective, just in the sense, again, that they just didn't really reflect on the concept because they've not had it yet. Another form of unreflective nonbelief, though, equally problematic, is the unreflective nonbelief of someone who is raised in a thoroughly non-theistic culture, where they might be aware of the concept, so maybe they've like heard it, right? They just, everything about their culture, all their epistemic authorities within in their life have like cemented in them the idea that theism is just not like a serious concept. It's not a serious intellectual possibility. And so they've just never reflected on it. They see it in the background. Oh, I know that there are theists. They exist over there. So they're aware of the concept, but they've never really dealt with it, right? So that's another form of unreflective non-belief. So it's a very big tent. It includes a lot of people. And so it does not matter whether they are innocents or not. As so long as they don't have belief in God, that is fair game as evidence for the hiddenness argument.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. One of the reasons why I hate external world skepticism is because it sets itself up to be irrefutable. There's a sort of pushback against what you've just said that I've seen online from Christians, which again, I kind of think sits in that sort of irrefutability space. So theists kind of confidently at times claim that those that call themselves non-resistant non-believers are actually resisting at some level. It might even be kind of self-deceptively, but there's still resistance in them. Otherwise, of course, they would give way and believe in God. How is it possible to even begin to try and counter this sort of way of thinking?
Yeah. So, there are possible counters to this, right? So there's a number of responses, I think, that the hiddenness advocate has available to them. First, I think it's really important to appreciate just how modest the relevant premise is, right? So the relevant premise in the argument, the hiddenness argument, is going to be something to the effect of, throughout all of human history, there has been at least one person who at least some point in their life didn't have a belief in God, and that their lacking the belief in God was not the result of their resisting God in a self-deceptive way, right? So that's like a super modest claim, like out of all of human history, that you just have one person who at one point in their life met these conditions, right? Given how modest it is, the first thing to say here is that the prior probability of this claim is just monstrously high relative to its denial, right? Because again, the denial would need to be a outright universal refusal of this, that like all persons who have ever not believed in God did so as a result of their resistance to God, right? That's a far bolder claim than at least one person at one point in their life did meet these conditions, right? So it's just, so unless you have like really, really, really strong evidence to get you to that universal claim, then you should, I think, default to the premise. You should think that at least one person, met these conditions. Secondly, I think that so the idea, right, is that like the idea of the person who replies in this way is that like, well, people only believe in God because they hate God, or they don't want to be held accountable or something to that effect, right? But the first thing another thing to note here is that like that's just not how people behave. It's a really bizarre way to think that like this is how humans actually interact with each other, right? We ignore people we don't like. We try and create distance from them, right? We don't like convince ourselves that they don't exist, right? That's like that'd be a really bizarre strategy. So like you could imagine like some kid who just like who grows up and just hates his parents for whatever reason. He thinks that they're super lame and just does not like them. He cannot wait to get out of the house. And so when he turns 18, moves out of the house, moves across the country because he just can't stand to be them. He doesn't want to like accidentally run into them at the grocery store, right? So and in having created this distance, he just like seethes further on this hatred for his parents. And then like he comes to like convince himself that they've like been killed or something like this, or like they died, so that like he doesn't have to live in a world with them anymore, right? Like that's like conceivable, like it's absurd, right? There's clearly something wrong with this dude, but like it's at least like remotely like plausible what we know about human psychology, right? Like it's not the most absurd thing in the world, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But now think about it this way, like let's say this kid so I guess what I'm trying to say, like my first point is that that's just not how we behave, right? We don't convince ourselves that people don't exist when we don't like them, right? So that's at least some evidence against the idea that like the reason we don't believe in God is because we don't like him. So we've like convinced ourselves that he doesn't exist, right? Moreover, I think this can be strengthened by pointing out that like the weight of the consequences of this kind of self-deception also matter here. So like say you're go back to this kid, right? So he's convinced himself his parents don't live anymore, aren't alive anymore. But let's say like through all this hatred he's like come to like, I don't know, couldn't hold a job or something, and so now he needs money, and what he's going to do, he's going to start robbing banks. But damn it, cops exist. It's like law enforcement exists. But wait, I can just use the same strategy I did with my parents, right? He can convince himself that law enforcement doesn't exist, right? So the obvious point being that like that's again not how we actually behave when it comes to not liking or like inconvenient people in our lives, right? So the weight of the consequences, it's going to be far harder to like convince yourself that like you can rob any bank you want and no one's ever going to catch you, right? No, there's no law enforcement that's going to hold you accountable. It's just not a plausible view of how anyone behaves in the face of someone they don't like or someone who can hold them accountable for something. So that's another a bit of evidence against this. Thirdly, you could just point to the fact of interpersonal testimony, right? There are people, assuming you're not like in some isolated like religious cult or something that living up in the mountains, there are people that belong to non-theistic religions that you're aware of, and that you become aware of this through testimony, either through the persons themselves or through books that you've read about them or news reports that you've seen. Or maybe people directly who don't believe in God, or belong to some non-theistic religion. Fourth, scientific testimony. So like anthropology, archaeology, the variety of human cultures that have existed that were not monotheistic, pointing to the fact that like this is monotheism is a relatively recent development in human history. And then lastly, I don't think we're limited to just making this positive case for these for non-resistant nonbelief. I think we can also find out what's motivating their resistance to this premise, right? Very often it is a particular interpretation of like a holy scripture or something, right? And I think this can be undercut if we can show them that there are good reasons to think that their particular interpretation is not the obviously correct one. It's not like uniquely plausible. And so that can kind of serve as like an undercutting defeater. But we can, I think, go further and rebut it by showing that there's actually a different interpretation that is more plausible and makes more sense of the larger context of the text, right? So obviously, this last point only applies to people who, are appealing to Scripture in a particular way. And the points I'm bringing up here are specific to people bringing up various passages in Paul or in the Psalms that, refer to, only the fool says in his heart that there is no God, and things like this, right? I think for a lot of these passages, there's a far better interpretation that renders it not really relevant to the Hiddenness argument. So yeah, I think that, there's a whole number of different concerns that can be pressed against this. I just don't think that it's a plausible. I think that if you're going to object to the Hiddenness argument, by all means, look into it and object to it. I think that this is the worst possible objection because again, it's intrinsically it's incredibly improbable just right off the bat, right? The premise is far more plausible than its negation. And then you have all these other concerns that come in after the fact that show that there's not even a good case to be made for the idea that everyone is resistant. So yeah, I think a good reply can be made.
No, I definitely agree. I think what's interesting is people become isolated in this or siloed in this space really quickly. So a pushback that I've heard to this, or I would have potentially have made as well when I was a believer, would have been that we're all sinful human beings. We're all, even if we're not aware of the fact that there is sin within us, we're aware that we are accountable to something outside of ourselves that is objectively true and real. And there's this sort of desire for us to either kind of discover what that objective sort of judgment or that objective judge looks like and begin to subject ourselves to their will, or to say, oh, no, it doesn't exist. There's nothing within me that's sinful or that's going to be judged. And we kind of go on with our lives. And it would be the latter that kind of people might say that they're kind of almost self-deceptively becoming kind of non-resistant non-believers because they aren't necessarily aware of this objective thing outside themselves. They're just going about their lives and just saying that it's just not true. But then if you look at it through various facets and lenses, you can kind of begin to see, basically, as you come outside of the silo, you can begin to see the different ways that this sort of thing can be knocked down. But before I jump into that, Justin, is there anything you wanted to say on that sort of interesting kind of potentially nuanced view?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I don't want to say that it's an intrinsically unreasonable reply, right? Because you can always identify some particular epistemic situation that someone might be in where this is a perfectly reasonable reply, right? If they're in some isolated religious cult and they've never met or interacted with anyone who is providing testimony of their belief and appears to be a morally sensitive individual, if the only exposure you have is testimony attesting to the claim that all non-believers are horrible people, if that's all you have, if that's all the testimony you have access to, then of course, right, that's your most reasonable conclusion is that well, obviously Schellenberg's Hiddenness argument fails on this count alone. But I mean, I'll give them that victory. That's a very modest victory, right? That's just not a response that's going to be available to the vast majority of people, especially given what you pointed out earlier, the interconnectedness of the world. These facts about the variety of ways of life that people have, the variety of different belief systems, and the fact that there are upstanding moral persons in each of them. The evidence is it can't be ignored at this point. We're just too interconnected.
Yeah, Yeah, it's so true. Okay, we've kind of circled around this idea of non-resistant non-belief for a while. Obviously, we're going to come back to that time and time and time again as we progress through the conversation. There's another really interesting kind of claim that Schellenberg levels in this argument, which is that God's perfect love would kind of perfectly value relationship for its own sake. And he kind of like lays it out by saying that God is often said to be this sort of like omnibenevolent thing, but benevolence and love, although intertwined, are separate things. So as the Hiddenness argument kind of deploys the idea of a perfectly loving God who wants to be in relationship to finite creatures, do you think that this is the logically right way to view the idea of God and his benevolence and love and how it would interact with finite beings such as ourselves? Like, is that the right framework to kind of begin to go down?
Yeah, I do. So I'm going to rewind just a little bit here. So, okay, so the concept of love, right? This is at the heart of the argument. What it means to love another person, like what is entailed by the claim, Jack loves Sally, right? Now, so Schellenberg kind of, to get to the argument, he introduces this, he introduces a kind of analysis of love. And he says, okay, well, love isn't just, Jack wishes the best for Sally, right? Because if that were the case, if Jack learned that like Sally would be better off, like would have a more enjoyable life if some other person could, step in and, give her a better life, then like Jack would step aside, right? That's not like, that would be weird to call that love. When we say that someone loves someone, part of what that is that they not only want the best for that person, but they want to draw that person close to them. They want to be like in a relationship. Maybe it's not like a romantic relationship, right? And like maybe like in the story of Jack, right? Like maybe someone else can like has better resources to give her a better life. That doesn't mean that he would like step away completely. Maybe he would maybe not seek a romantic relationship, but he would still want to be friends with her because he loves her. He wants to have that closeness, wants to be related to her, right? So it's important to really focus on the fact that love includes benevolence, as you say, but it goes past that. So it's not just, again, wishing the best for them, it's wanting to be related to them. So with that in mind, then we ask, okay, well, if we were to turn to the concept of God and ask, well, God is perfectly loving, right? Is the claim. Like, clearly love should be a great-making property. And if God has all great-making properties to their maximal degree, their maximal compossible degree, then love must be among them, right? So then, okay, well, now we can attribute the concept of love to God. What does that tell us about God's behavior? Are there entailments that fall out of realizing that God is perfectly loving? Well, if he's perfectly loving, he's going to love any finite creature that he creates. And what is entailed by that? Well, it is entailed that he would perhaps desire, he would desire a relationship with these persons. He would want the best for them, and he would desire a relationship with them. But what's really nice about this is that, like, Schellenberg is going to go even more modest than that in this argument. He wants to say that, like, maybe God isn't going to pursue. So God's not going to like, knock on our doors and want a relationship with us. He's going to maybe perhaps leave it open to us to make the first move, to kind of like to decide when the relationship begins or how it develops in its first few stages or something to that effect, right? So, but what God is going to do, he's going to ensure that we're always in a position to be able to do that. He's never going to block us off completely. So, like, if we return to like the concept of like Jack, the story of Jack and Sally, right? Jack loves Sally. What would it mean to say that Jack loves Sally if like he is doing something or failing to do something that makes it the case that Sally can never reach out to him to begin a relationship, right? You would be like, well, Jack doesn't love Sally. Like that's a confusion of the concept of love. Like if Jack like refuses to give out his email, or um like if she comes by to visit him, he like turns off all the lights and like, hides in the basement or something. Jack doesn't love Sally. Like that's just what that means. He's clearly doing everything in his power to resist any kind of beginning of a relationship with Sally, like a personal relationship. And so the same is true for God, is the claim, right? So if God loves us, then at the very least, he must make it the case that we are always in a position to enter relationship should we choose to do so, and should we put some effort into doing it. Now, that does not mean that it's going to be easy for us. It doesn't mean that like just simply because I want to enter a relationship with God that it's going to be, super easy to do. He's, he's going to be if he's a morally perfect person, plausibly, he's going to have very high moral demands. And he's going to say, okay, you want to enter a relationship? Here's what you must do. You've got to work on your character. You've got to, if you want time with the divine, you got to put in the time. And so, yeah, none of this ensures, again, that like the relationship is going to be, cake and roses. It can be very hard work, and God can use this to kind of, use this complexity to kind of, I guess what I'm trying to say is use this complexity to bring about certain character development or things like that, right? So yeah, so the concept of love. That's really what it all boils down to. What does that mean when we apply it to God, right? Now, to get to your question, which was regarding the difference between, the concept of love and the concept of omnibenevolence, then yes, God wants the best for us again, but again wants to be related to us. Now, the reason God would want to be related to us, they're twofold. First, he would want to ensure that that the participants stand to benefit from relationships, and sometimes they stand to benefit in unique ways in relationship contexts like this, right? But they're also good for their own sake. Relationships are good for their own sake, not just for the benefits that are accrued by the participants. So that's the general kind of framework that Schellenberg kind of puts on the table before kind of unpacking the details of the argument. Because it turns out that what it would mean for God to be open in this minimal way is for God to ensure belief. And that's obviously where the Hiddenness argument kind of, pours some gas on the situation.
So I can think of a few kind of listeners or theists that I know that would push back in different ways against what you've just said. I think it'd be good to dive into those. The first one is probably more nuanced than the second, but if you look at something like Calvinism, obviously Calvinism kind of insubstantiates this idea of sort of predestination, like the elect are already known, basically, and kind of those elected are going to be saved. So it's almost as if God doesn't care if people do or don't believe in him, because he's obviously still going to bring them into existence regardless of kind of where their eternal state's going to be placed. So, Calvinism might not necessarily be true, but there might be other ways that people kind of bring this idea of God being okay with not everybody believing in him and therefore not entering into a relationship with him. How would you begin to kind of, I guess, push back against that sort of more nuanced theistic position?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to say, I suppose, is just that, in reply to the Hiddenness argument, one is always going to be free to just, deny the concept of God that the Hiddenness argument applies to, right? So again, the Hiddenness argument is specifically concerned with a perfectly loving God. Now, Calvinism, at least as I understand it, where God just does not care about relationship, at least for some persons, clearly is not perfectly loving. And so I just think that, they're certainly free to adopt a different view of God, but I would say that that's certainly a theologically troubling view of God. So, but I mean, that's a theological debate, less than a philosophical debate, I suppose. I just don't think the hiddenness argument applies to that particular view, and it's because I think they've got a really poor view of the divine. I think that's like a really sad and troubling view of the divine.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think things like Calvinism have been brought into kind of fruition because people are trying to understand why, Auntie Mary wasn't saved. Like, was there anything they could have done? And almost there wasn't anything they could have done. And you kind of see the same development within the idea of heaven and hell, right? You see heaven and hell beginning to be instantiated because justice wasn't given during this life. That person got away with these horrific kind of atrocities that they performed on people, and these people were the victims and they never got their recompense. And you can kind of begin to see why things like heaven and hell began to become more and more kind of prevalent, and things like Calvinism as well, and sort of predestination. You need to begin to put more and more pieces or chess pieces on the chessboard to make sense of the game that we're playing with theism. It's really fascinating. I guess a chess piece that's been put on the board more recently is this sort of idea of kind of skeptical theism, which again kind of more applies to the problem of evil. But I think it'd be interesting to try and deploy it in the hiddenness argument and kind of see where we get to with it. So I guess if you were going to deploy skeptical theism for the hiddenness argument, it would go along the lines of something like, how would we expect ourselves to even know what God would or wouldn't do in a given situation? Say, for example, being kind of willing or not willing to enter into a relationship with a finite person.
Yeah. No, that's a move that has been made in the literature by a number of authors. So one thing to note here is that it is the theist that is proposing that God is all-loving, right? All we're doing on the hiddenness argument end of things is trying to find out what the bare minimal content is of that statement that God is all-loving, right? So again, Schellenberg infers a very minimal concept of openness. Not that God is after you, after to form a relationship with you, just that he's going to be open. He's going to ensure that nothing prevents one from entering a relationship with God if they wanted to, right? So the skeptical theist kind of walks into the room and says, hey, in reply to the hiddenness argument, we just don't know. We're not really in a position to know. And perhaps this is because, God can, order things such that there are causes that we don't understand until 100 years later. Perhaps it's because God has reasons beyond our understanding. All these different things, right? So the analogy brought up by skeptical theists often is one of a parent who brings their child in for a booster shot or something, right? So the child's perspective, they're ushered into this room by this this scary room where this guy takes a needle to his arm and pokes him, causing pain. The child is wondering, what on earth? My parents are monsters, that they brought me to this situation and they allowed this person to do this to me. Not realizing, of course, that there are greater goods beyond their comprehension, namely their future health, that justify their parents bringing them to that situation and ensuring that medical treatment. So the skeptical theist wants to say that we are much like the child in that scenario. We form this hiddenness argument and say, why do people not believe in God? Not realizing that God has all these other reasons that we are we don't have access to. One of the main reason I think that this does not work is because, again, we're going to be going back to the concept of love, and we're going to do that analysis, right? If the entailments fall out of that, if the entailments that fall out of that analysis provide the basis for the premises that Schellenberg is positing here, then when they say that there are other reasons God has that conflict with those things, possibly, then they are just denying that the conceptual analysis was correct. So they're just saying, they're just denying the conceptual analysis of love. So they're in a sense begging the question, because we've made the argument, we've made the conceptual analysis, we've come to a conclusion about the minimal openness of God, and then they're saying, but no, but they're not. They need to interact with the argument. They need to interact with the conceptual analysis. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say to that, is that like it's not enough to just point to that, because you're essentially just begging the question. You're assuming that a case has not been made when in fact it has been made. So they need to interact with that case, I think.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I guess kind of pushing this on then a little bit. I don't think that we can necessarily decide what we do or do not believe. I think we discover that rather than decide that. And it's arguably true that a conscious relationship and belief are sort of prerequisites to engage with God. At least Schellenberg kind of goes into that within his book. So if one doesn't believe in God, is it fair to say they can't participate in a relationship with God just by trying?
Well, I think that like, so you say relationship, right? There are, there are various kinds of relationship, right? So Schellenberg is specifically interested in personal relationships. So perhaps there are kinds of relationships that one could have with a God that are possible to have without even believing that God exists, right? I mean, that's I think a broadly conceptual space that, is plausible that you could have room for, right? The hiddenness argument is going to be silent on those kinds of relationships, though, right? So what matters to the hiddenness argument is, rather than relationship generally, it's personal relationship. Because again, God is personal. He created persons. And so the relationship that love, at least if love is done perfectly, the relationship that love would be aimed at would be a relationship that is conscious, explicit, and meaningful, and allows for the kind of interaction, the explicit interaction between two persons. And that's just what Schellenberg is calling a personal relationship. So yeah, on the one hand, I would want to leave room for saying that, like, if God exists and you don't believe in God, there is a sense in which you could have various kinds of relationship with God. But again, what really matters to love done perfectly would be personal relationship. At least I'm compelling. I find the reasons they're compelling, that's specifically what God would be interested in. He's not going to rest content with this kind of like implicit, worshiping the good, not recognizing that the good is actually a person. It seems to me like, again, love done perfectly would want personal relationship.
Yeah, I like it. I'm aware that I'm saying things that are kind of, I guess, deliberately being obnoxious or facetious around the hiddenness argument, because I really hope this video helps people to grapple with the things that theists would say or think, and therefore think that they've answered the hiddenness argument just off the cuff, whereas actually we need to keep bringing people back to the argument rather than their idea of what God is, which is interesting.
Yeah.
A thing that Schellenberg goes into in the book, which I love because I love kind of history and the lineage that our species has come from, is basically kind of early or proto-humans. And the idea is, you've already mentioned that kind of belief in sort of in like an omni-god is quite a modern thing, especially kind of within the West as well, arguably. I guess religious practices have come about in various societies and various ways throughout the whole of kind of history span. So as far as I can tell, and Schellenberg argues in the book, this means that for most conscious life, it's failed to believe in God without resistance to God, because the very concept of God that we would deploy today within philosophy, if we're trying to be as honest and as reflective we can be on what the Christian God looked like, just fails to be an actual thing at that time and place. Do you want to explore this a little bit for us, Justin?
Yeah. So one of the you had mentioned that most conscious life has failed to believe in God without resistance to God, right? So one thing I would want to highlight is your use of the word, like, of the phrase conscious life, right? So Schellenberg does want to restrict the argument or the relevant forms of non-belief to persons who are capable of belief and of relationship, but just don't believe, or whatever the case may be, right? So he doesn't think that, like an infant, for example, he doesn't think that their non-belief is a problem, right? He doesn't think that their non-belief is a problem for God. But once the individual grows to the point where they have both the affective capacities and the relational capacities and the belief capacities to both believe in and relate to God. Once a person has those capacities, those cognitive capacities, once they come online, from that moment on, they should have belief, according to Schellenberg. So I do want to make that point. But as to the question of whether or not it could ever even count as, whether or not it could even make sense that someone is resisting when they have not even had the concept of God. Yeah, I think you're right about that. Like, I think it doesn't make any sense at all to say that, right? Because, like, if your ignorance is the explanation for your non-belief, then it's just not the case that your resistance is the explanation for your non-belief, right? Like, so it's going to have to be one or the other, right? Like, it's either going to be that you look at a particular ancient individual in a pre-monotheistic world, and you say, okay, they don't believe. What's the explanation for this? If it's that they just don't have the capacity, or they don't have the capacity to assess it because they don't have the concepts in mind, right? So there's no sense in which they can assess the concept and form an opinion, whether or not it be negative or positive, right? So they're not even going to form an affective opinion about a concept that they don't have, right? So the explanation for their non-belief can only be their conceptual ignorance of God, right? So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that, like, those persons are, I think, the most potent example of non-resistant non-belief, because you don't have to deal with you don't have to talk about whether Alex O'Connor, right, is a non-resistant non-believer. You don't have to worry about those questions, like, oh, maybe there's some resistance he's got inside that he's not aware of, or that he's not being honest about, or something like that. Like, you can just set all those questions aside and be like, okay, well, what about these persons prior to the concept even coming on the scene? Those people clearly are not resistant. So at the very least, if you want to like cut out all the other forms of non-belief and just focus on that, that's still a really, really powerful argument, because it still shines the light on the tension between that non-belief and the fact that God, if he exists, is supposed to be perfectly loving, and the entailments that fall out of that should be seen in the actual world, if God exists in the actual world. So, yeah.
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favorite podcast app, and whilst you're there, Please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. Yeah, no, it's really cool. And I think theists, believers, they often kind of say, even if the sort of omni-God wasn't something that was within the 200,000 years ago, there were still religious practices, or we can see Neanderthal burial sites with beads, etc., various things kind of buried with them, which kind of might hint at an afterlife idea. So there's sort of potentially an argument for religious or spiritual traditions going before us, then coming into us and almost being inherited by us. And these things get deployed as arguments or reasons to show that, it is fundamentally within our nature that belief is a necessary foundation, and therefore that means God. What Schellenberg does in the Hiddenness Argument, which I found to be quite powerful, was kind of deploy the opposite end of the spectrum, which is that it's very possible for today for people to live completely non-religious lives. So I guess my question would be, does this reality prove that non-belief in or any deity is also a natural human phenomenon, much like religion?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I'm not sure. Well, let me say this. I'll say that non-belief in the sense of not believing in God, right? So non-belief in the sense relevant to the argument here. That is, of course, very natural, right? So, I mean, that's kind of the, prior to having that bit of religious technology that is the concept of God, non-belief would be the default state. Not to say that atheism is a default state. I'm not making that claim. I'm just saying that if you don't have the concept, then you don't have the concept to form a positive doxastic attitude about it, right? So it seems to me quite clearly natural, at least in that sense. But I'm not sure that that's that. The fact that we can in our modern world live a fulfilling non-religious life, I'm not sure that proves that. I think that certainly adds another dimension onto the argument. But I guess I would be hesitant to say that that latter fact proves the former, just because I think that former was already reasonable to believe. Just because, again, as we were talking about the innocence, right? If you don't have the concept, back prior to you having the concept, you don't believe, and that's a very natural thing. It's a very natural state to be in. Again, it's the religious conceptual technology of the concept of God that when it comes on the scene, now you've got to form an opinion one way or the other. So
yeah, I think we've covered some really, really interesting ground. There are a few more things I want to get onto the table, and then we can dive into the argument and kind of close looking at that briefly, and hopefully that's kind of enough for people to want to go away and watch your playlist, but also kind of read the book itself. Theists will deploy their experience or claimed experience of God as factors or reasons against the hiddenness argument. I think this is a really tricky one to get around, because if I had a religious experience, I think that would be very, very significant and therefore worthy of me to go, okay, I might have got something wrong. How and can the hiddenness argument begin to tackle individuals that really do believe they've had an experience of the divine? Is it possible for this argument to come against that? But potentially they're two different things, so maybe not. But I'll pass it back to you, Justin.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, there's a number of ways to kind of discuss this, I suppose. I mean, so, how would someone who has had a religious experience and who has had their belief in God strengthened as a result, how would they interact with the hiddenness argument once they come across it and they fully understand it, right? I mean, it seems like obviously they're going to want to resist the conclusion to the argument, right? If they have had an experience that they have interpreted as being of God, specifically the God concept at the center of the argument, then they're going to want to resist the conclusion. The question is, okay, well, how would they do that, right? So they're going to have to kind of do like essentially like a Moorian shift away from that conclusion to say like, okay, well, I believe in God, and so clearly the argument must be faulty in some sense. God exists, and this experience has made him more certain than ever. So clearly, there's something wrong with the argument, right? And so then, okay, well, then you would just want to explore where they would want to push back on the argument, and maybe they don't have any particular place to push back. Maybe they just have this general idea that like, well, something's wrong with the argument, right? Whether it's premise 1, 2, 3, whatever it may be. Maybe I'm not equipped currently to assess it, right? That's, I think, a reasonable position to be in, that you could say that like, I don't really know where it's wrong, but I know it's wrong, right? Like I know there's something wrong with the argument because I've got this other belief here that's like more certain than anything, right? That's, I think, like an appropriate response in some contexts. So I guess another thing I would want to say, though, is that like, can we really be certain that like the religious experience we had was of God, right? Because again, remember, like, even if it was like a window into a supernatural reality, like let's say you had this experience that was just otherworldly, and you like come to be convinced that it's like it was a window into this other reality, this kind of foundational reality. Okay, that's super interesting and really, really cool. Like that's amazing. But what would it mean to say that you experienced specifically that reality is a person, that like the foundation of reality is like the ultimate, essentially, right? The ultimate is a person who is specifically omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly loving, right? It seems like you could have like what would be I guess I'm thinking of like the phenomenology of this, right? Like, how would you know, like, would you be able to tell the difference between experiencing God and experiencing a very powerful, very good, and very knowledgeable being, or even like a more powerful, more good, and more knowledgeable entity of some sort, like just even slightly more knowledgeable than the smartest person on earth, right? Like it seems like, I don't know, I'm skeptical of the claim that like you'd be able to experience specifically an omnipotent God, like you would recognize that, relative to other things. And so, I mean, it could be that like you saw a finite God of some sort, and that the Hiddenness argument doesn't really apply to that. Like maybe God doesn't exist, but like you saw, you had a window to reality, then you saw that there was a foundational being that like just wasn't all powerful or wasn't all knowing or perfectly loving. Seems to me like I don't know how one could possibly, I guess is what I'll say. I don't know how it could be possible to say that your experience showed you a window into this specific degree of power of the being on the other side of that experience. Like that kind of like, yeah, I'm skeptical that could be possible. But again, if you did come to that conclusion on the basis of that experience, then, the way to interact with the Hiddenness argument is to find an objection or, Moorian shift away from the conclusion. So, yeah, I guess I don't know that was particularly useful, but those are just some thoughts I had about the question.
No, I love it. I mean, like the more I read about or read within the space of philosophy, right, the more I see like atheistic substance dualists. That's a thing, right? I think a lot of theists don't realize that that's a thing. And you can go down panpsychism, whatever, different branches of non-religious belief that isn't necessarily strictly materialist or atheistic. And you've got someone like Michael Huemer, right? Michael Huemer believes in souls, but he's not a Christian. Doesn't believe that God exists in the classic omni sense or the O3 world creator sense that he would define it. So it's a fascinating space to explore. And you're right, it's very difficult for somebody to have an experience and to back it up with evidence that proves that it kind of relates to the potential belief system or framework within which they're already working and actioning. We do this with things all the time. We will read everything through the lenses that we're wearing at that moment in time.
Yeah, another good point.
Yeah. Okay, there's two more things I want to dive into before we look at the argument. The first one is this idea of mystery. So theists love to roll out that kind of God is, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and yet when they get to the sort of kind of cornered states, they all begin to say, it's mysterious. We don't know why, we don't know how, we're not sure, and it's very frustrating. I guess if you were to put yourself in the shoes of a theist, do you think that mystery is ever a good apologetic defense for Christianity, specifically if you were to be leveled the Hiddenness Argument challenge?
I'm going to say no. So whether or not it's ever a good strategy, it depends on exactly what the appeal consists in, right? Like if you're just saying, I don't know, then it seems to me like that's a perfectly fine response to, various challenges of whatever the case may be, right? But if it's, I guess, well, I will say, first of all, that like an appeal to mystery in response to explanatory concerns that's tantamount to admitting that your metaphysical hypothesis is just very weak on explanatory power, right? And so you risk undermining the very reasons you had to, for believing in it in the first place. But there's another sense in which, like you mentioned, like in response to the Hiddenness argument specifically, right? Well, in the dialectical context here, right? Like if I present the argument from divine hiddenness and I get to a conclusion, the job of the participants in that discussion is to either, accept the conclusion, agree with me on the conclusion, or to identify some misstep in the argument or some false premise, such that they can avoid the conclusion, right? But at the point where I present it, the burden then shifts to them to identify where that error is, or to just, say that there's an error, but I don't know where it is, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're saying as the appeal to mystery, at least as I am thinking of it here. So in a sense, it kind of amounts to a kind of refusal to continue the dialogue. So at least in the dialectical context, it's not a helpful move, because it's the end of the conversation, right? Like once you say, once you appeal to the mystery, there's nothing more to say, I guess, at that point. Now, it could be that the appeal to mystery is more, sometimes it gets blurred into appeals to like skeptical theism, right? And if that's the case, then I would just appeal to some of those comments I made earlier about how it's kind of, you're assuming a case hasn't been made when one has been made, and it's on you to then reply to that. So there's a sense in which the skeptical theist begs the question against the Hiddenness argument. But the appeal to mystery could mean a number of different things, and I guess more specific comments would be contingent on the exact nature of the appeal.
Fair. Yeah, absolutely fair. I think we're getting to the point now where it would be good to look at the Hiddenness argument itself. So I'm going to pull that up on the screen. For those listening to it, I will read it in just a moment. This argument is presented kind of very, very near the sort of kind of final few pages of the Hiddenness Argument book itself by Schellenberg. Again, there'll be a link in the description to that book if you want to check it out. So obviously Schellenberg goes through a whole host of kind of explanatory depths and premises and kind of I guess, a supportive material to each of these to each of these premises themselves. So if something here kind of grabs you and you go, I'm not sure about that, it's worth looking at the book. It's worth reading the secondary resources as well, and then kind of diving into some of that stuff, because he does go through tons of stuff that we've not touched on today. Okay, let me read this out and then we can kind of dive into it. So premise 1, if a perfectly loving God exists, then there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. Premise 2, if there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relationship to the proposition that God exists. Premise 3, if a perfectly loving God exists, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relationship to the proposition that God exists. Brackets from 1 and 2, close brackets. Premise 4, some finite persons are or have been non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. Premise 5, no perfectly loving God exists. Brackets from 3 and 4, close brackets. Premise 6, if no perfectly loving God exists, then God does not exist. And the concluding premise, God does not exist. Brackets from 4 and 5, from 5 and 6, close brackets. So again, this is the final sort of kind of full logical argument that Schellenberg deploys. It's a deductive argument. It's fascinating. I think I kind of dive in here briefly. The sort of bits that kind of, I guess, hold sway for me is kind of there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite persons. I guess it's the things we've been speaking about today is this always personal, kind of any finite person. These are the things that are obviously core to this argument, Justin. So as we're presenting on the screen, is there anything further you want to dive into with the Hiddenness argument?
Yeah, so with that first premise, right, a lot of that stuff I talked about with the conceptual analysis of what it means to love another person, that's all going to be in service to that first premise, right? Because again, that first premise states that if a perfectly loving God exists, then there exists a God who's always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. Remember, the whole motivation for that was that, like, first we analyze the concept of love. We appeal to, at the end of the day, the concept of love is a human concept, right? We use it in particular ways. And so we're not going to agree on all the details that it might entail, but we're going to be able to at least agree on some very basic, minimal entailments of love. And so, again, we, through some analogies and things, we were able to kind of find out that, like, well, love at the very least means that you're like, you don't, you want to ensure that, like, the person that you love, your beloved is you're never going to do anything that's going to cause them to not be in a position to enter a relationship with you, right? And you're going to want to, like, on the flip side of that is being that, like, you would want to perform actions that would ensure that they are in a position to enter a relationship with you. And so the premise 1 just takes that concept and then applies it to God and says that, well, God is always going to ensure that persons that he loves are going to be in a position to enter a relationship with God. And so that's what he means by open, that, like, God is going to be open in the sense that he's not going to do anything himself to prevent others from being in a position to enter a relationship with him. And he's certainly not going to fail to do anything that would otherwise prevent them from being able to enter a relationship with him. So that first premise is just, there's so much there. It's a whole lot of inferences from the base concept of love all the way up to what it would mean for God to be perfectly loving. And then 2 takes that insight from number 1 and says that what that openness would entail is that persons would believe in God. At least, that they're let me see here. If there exists a God who's always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, which is, the premise of one essentially, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. So again, premise 2 just takes premise number 1 and just says that like no person is going to be non-resistantly in a state of non-belief. That like essentially there's going to be no non-resistant non-believers. Everyone will believe in God unless they are resisting, essentially, is what premise 2 takes, having gained insight from number 1. And then 3 is just the conclusion when you add those two together, which just says that, if a perfectly loving God exists, then there are no persons that are non-resistantly in a state of non-belief. 4 is the claim that there are, in fact, persons that are non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. And again, this is because this is, appealing to how broad the net of non-belief is, right? We talked about reflective and non-reflective forms of non-belief. We talked about the innocence. We've talked about all the various forms in which non-belief might take. And this premise just, shines a light on how broad that tent in fact is. And then 5, we get, that there's a tension, of course, between 3 and 4. No perfectly loving God exists, is what 5 tells us. And then, you can go on, continue with that, like as to what, like, no perfectly loving God exists, then no God exists, right? Because God would be perfectly loving if he did exist. And that's an argument from just the claim that like love is surely a great making property and would be a part of God, essentially. So yeah, that's the general kind of argument. Obviously, that's a bit more complex than, just dealing with whether or not, this form of non-belief exists and whether or not God would ensure that it doesn't, right? So that's a kind of a quick rundown of the argument.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. I mean, and you can see things like, for instance, within premise 2, I'll just read it again. If there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. And you can see why a theist would then deploy, even if somebody is subconsciously or kind of unaware of it, they're trying to resist to some, like you can begin to see where theists would try and deploy their arguments. And I hope in the sort of prelude to showing this argument up on the screen that we've at least begun to whet people's appetites to understand the different viewpoints that people are going to be coming to this argument with. I was kind of debating with myself whether I wanted to show this argument right at the beginning or right at the end, because I think both would be beneficial. But actually having it here at the very end, I think after we've gone through the sort of deluge of different ideas that kind of found within this, different arguments that I've noticed kind of being raised more commonly than not against it, I hope that the listener and the viewer are in a position to go away and engage with this argument, because it's fascinating. You kind of alluded, Justin, that this argument was almost an argument that kind of affected you to come out of a belief system about God. I know it was for myself, so I won't speak for you, but it sounded like that was the case. But I didn't have words for it. I didn't have it articulated in such a way that Schellenberg has done. So, Justin, to kind of close, is there anything else you want to say about this argument and your own story before we, look to bring it to a close?
Yeah, no, I think that that's right to some degree, right? Like, so hiddenness concerns more generally. When I, like I was saying at the beginning, where like my prayer life started to feel like I was not really interacting with another person, right? Like a distinct person. That did cause me to lose my faith, I think, or at least it was one of the primary reasons. And so, yeah, this is all, intertwined with that same idea. So, there's a meta point right there, like that. It's like, okay, well, psychologically, I couldn't maintain my belief in the absence of really feeling like there was a God there, right? But then there's like this higher order idea where like, well, if God existed, you would assume, for reasons that this argument kind of provides us, if God existed, you would think that it would be very that it would not be the case that persons would lose their faith because they feel like God is distant, right? So there's the kind of like the first person like psychological fact of like, what my experience was like in my prayer life. And then there's the higher order fact that like I wasn't really aware of, right? Like I wasn't thinking about it in this way. But certainly the fact that that I lost my faith in the very process of attempting to connect with God, surely that is something I was right to find surprising, given the existence of such a perfectly loving God.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the sort of final question, or the final question on the Hiddenness Argument before I get you to kind of share, Justin, where people can find out more about you and the Real Theology podcast is, I guess it could be quite challenging when somebody is presented with an argument like this. There's almost an emotional or a gut reaction, and then there's a reaction, a rational or emotional reaction as well. I guess, what's the stance that people should adopt if they were to be presented with an argument like this and find it convincing? Like, if say a believer has watched this and they've been kind of hit by what Schellenberg's done with this deployment of the Hiddenness argument, kind of how would you encourage somebody? Maybe their emotions are saying no, it's not true, but their intellect and rationality is saying warning bell, something's here. Like, how would you encourage somebody to go away and engage with this further to kind of see where it leads?
Yeah, so I mean, like if someone, hears the argument and they've assessed it and they find it compelling, and as a result they lose their belief in God, and to be clear, that would be very unlikely unless they were like, already kind of on the way out. Like this is like, that's just not, it's not psychologically realistic, right? That someone's going to hear an argument like this and then shift so radically, right? That would almost be like irresponsible to some degree. But like, yeah, let's say someone hears it and they find the argument compelling. One question you might ask is like, okay, well, what then? Right? Like, should they become a naturalist? Right? Should they just think that there is no such thing as anything of any religious significance? Well, no, I think that would be clearly too fast, right? Like if they oriented their life around religious ideas, concepts, and the religious life, essentially, if that's what their life was, then abandoning all of that seems a bit hasty, right? So, then they learn that God doesn't exist. Well, that's not the end of the world, right? Like, so from then they can explore other non-theistic forms of ultimism, right? So, and people have proposed a number of different ideas. And what's exciting now is that philosophers of religion are taking these ideas more and more seriously by the day. And I think that's a super exciting trend to see in philosophy of religion. So you have ideas like, axiarchism, which has been around for a few decades. John Leslie advocated this. But just like a few years ago, Tim Mulligan put out a book, An Anthropocentric Purposivism. I knew I was going to butcher that. But this is similar to axiarchism, where it's like this idea where like things are oriented toward like an end, like an organizational end or a value end. Nature's not completely blind, essentially. And that in some ways you can find certain hypotheses that like get the best of both worlds, right? So like say you posit a being who's like just not morally perfect, but he's all powerful, he's all knowing. And so you could have like the best explanatory parts of theism without the problem of evil, right? So you don't have to worry about that. That's a hypothesis that avoids that as a problem altogether. And then you get, and hiddenness isn't really going to be a concern if the being doesn't really care about us. You know what I mean? Like maybe he's not an evil being; he just like doesn't have much interest in humanity. Then this would seem to have some explanatory benefit over more traditional concepts of theism. So like these kind of newer ideas, I should say, being kind of thrown around more recently in philosophy of religion, I think is really exciting for that reason. Like we're kind of stepping outside of these very traditional ideas, like your I guess materialism, like, you know, obviously it's an ancient idea in some sense, but like being very popular in the academy among philosophers is, you know, relatively recent still, right? So, but taking those ideas and like not pretending that the debate has only and ever will ever be about theism versus naturalism. It's a broader conversation. The religious landscape is a far richer landscape than I think most people appreciate. And so, yeah, like I said, I think it's an exciting time in philosophy of religion for that reason. These ideas are being taken more seriously.
Justin, I love your mind. I love your character. I love the Real Atheology podcast. Where do you want to point people to engage more with you and the work you do in that space?
So yeah, it's the Real Atheology podcast. It's same name for the YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter as well. So we try to put out, I mean, we don't do it as much as we should, but we try to put out like an episode a month. But it's difficult because, you know, I mean, these things take time to prepare, and I don't enjoy conducting interviews. I honestly don't. It gives me so much anxiety to do. I try not to do that kind of content, but there are other people on our team that do, and they do a fantastic job. For me, I like to script my stuff. I like to be, you know, really, really intentional about the word choices and, you know, be very careful about things. So there's a variety of different content on our show. It's interviews, short form, like lectures almost, and explorations of different contemporary concepts in philosophy of religion. So yeah, it's a kind of labor of love for us.
It's a great show. I honestly thoroughly enjoy it. There'll be links obviously to you and the podcast, etc., in the description. So listener, viewer, check those out. And it's funny that you mentioned interviewing people. Like, this is what I do, right? I read a book and talk to either the author or somebody about the subject matter. I've got a conversation with Richard Swinburne coming up in a few months' time, and I'm already sweating bullets about this conversation. So that'll be fun. I'll let you know how badly that goes when it happens. But anyway, Justin, thank you so much for your time, mate. It's been absolute pleasure. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Samuel. I appreciate your show. I loved your interview with Oppie, and you're doing really good content here. So it's good stuff.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.